Cool. Welcome to the Beyond Cinema studio up here at Sundance, Mr. Stanley Nilsson. Congratulations on being up here again.
Thank you so much.
Ninth time.
Yeah.
Any of the experiences stand out more than any other?
This one stands out. This one really stands out because we were in our early stages. I mean, we weren't on the typical Sundance path where you're, editing your film and gonna finish right on time for Sundance. We were just editing, and all of a sudden I realized that if we didn't make this Sundance, it was gonna be too late next year. So we're like, okay, let's just send in what we've got, and then we got in,
Yep.
and then they said, but we want to see another cut. So the last few months have just been insane trying to get this thing ready. We finished like 4 days before
Wow.
before our premiere.
And that feeling of a filmmaker coming to Sundance and sitting there and seeing the film for the first time with a full audience, is that ever not exciting? Like, is that still feel as fresh as it did?
Yeah, I mean, it's super exciting. I think it feels even more exciting to me because the first film I had here was 18 years ago, and Sundance has just gotten bigger.
Yeah.
And I knew Sundance was a big thing when we got in 18 years ago. Well, we didn't know how big. We just made this film, and
Yeah.
it's like, oh, you're in Sundance. Okay, great.
Yeah.
And actually, the first time I was here, my wife gave birth during my first screening. So I did.
So she was pretty
That was it.
excited.
No, yeah, I left. I mean, I only made it through one screening, and I got a phone message that my water broke. So I went up and I said, for the Q&A, I said my wife's water broke. I got to go. See you later. And that was it. That was my Sundance experience.
That's funny. Why is it important to tell the story of the black colleges and universities? I'll preface that as well by saying every time I see one of your films, I learn something that I had no idea about because of the way you contextualize the experience and how we got to today. And I had no idea that it was illegal even for white people to educate blacks, going back, back to the time of slavery and even kind of that middle ground before as people were coming out. I had no idea that it was actually not only illegal for blacks to study and pursue that education, but that it was actually illegal and punishable for whites to teach. For me, that was just an important lesson learned as well in terms that it kind of influences how we got to today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, excuse me, I think your point is perfect. I mean, it's a film that helps us understand where we are today and how we got here. Black colleges have been one of the central institutions in forming African American society to what it is today. So it's been very important in structuring American society. So it's been, it's just this central story that I don't think anybody knows. Nobody's kind of put it together in that same way.
Yeah.
There's not really a lot of great books on it, and there haven't been any films. But there have been very few institutions that African Americans have. The church. I did a film early on about black newspapers, which was a huge institution at one point, and probably black colleges. That's been about it.
Yeah. Another distinction that I think is important is that black colleges provided an education that wasn't being given.
Right.
But even if black people were going to white colleges and getting an education, they weren't getting the philosophies or the spirit or the true history or the a integrated experience. They weren't getting any of those kind of benefits of language that make it important for someone to understand their own history. So is it enough to give people an education, or does that education have to be kind of relevant in order to foster philosophies and thought that are kind of progressive?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's funny because we were talking yesterday after the screening about it, because one of the women who was working there said, North Carolina A&T, and we were talking about how you see so many people who've gone to black colleges who are doing well, and I think part of that is because you get this kind of nurturing piece of it besides getting an education.
Yeah.
You get this piece that says, it's not going to be easy out there. Yeah, there's going to be racism, there's going to be prejudice, but you have to work through it. You get that kind of thing, that hard work. If there's an old saying for black people that a black man has to work twice as hard. So you'll get in a black college, you say, well, just work twice as hard then, because now you know what you have to do going in.
Yeah.
So there's that whole nurturing piece that happened early on, as you say, before the late 60s, something like 97% of black people who went to college went to a black college. But besides that, there was also this real nurturing piece that was part of it back then, and still part of what black colleges provide.
Yeah, I mean, it's what's also super interesting about it is that, in effect, if the education of African Americans is successful enough and our racism is diminished to a point where the integration of blacks and whites is positive enough, then black colleges and universities may kind of cease to exist.
Right.
So their purpose for them even being generated, in the long term, the hope might be that they're not even necessary.
Right. Well, it's funny that you say that, because in the film I did about black newspapers, the final chapter was called "Putting Themselves Out of Business," and that's what they did. They pushed for integration. They pushed for Jackie Robinson and baseball to become integrated. They were one of the main forces behind that, and other things. And they basically put themselves out of business. I think that, yeah, if we could ever get to that day that you're talking about, I think that black colleges could happily go out of business. But I'm not sure if we're even getting closer to that moment right now.
I know, we're approaching 50 years since Martin Luther King's assassination, 50 years since Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, 50 years since the Democratic National Convention riots, the civil rights legislation. And it seems that, especially over the course of the last couple of years, that it's not just not where we started, but there's a whole rift of new problems that exist.
Right. I think one of the real problems is that America has such a hard time taking a real clear-eyed look at its history. So as you say, when you look at Tell Them We Are Rising, you find out that it was illegal for black people to even learn to read and write. It was illegal for even to teach them. I mean, that's where we started out. And there's a whole group of society today is kind of like feeling like, okay, you've had enough. We've given you enough. And I'm not sure, like, when did that giving start, and like what exactly were we given it, and when did that happen?
Well, that's why I think some of the language in the film is interesting too, because it's not necessarily that you have to get to a positive, it's that you have to remove a negative. It's like saying that these colleges are unapologetically black, right? Or that there's a threat of education, or that there's a greedy thirst for knowledge, right? It's like, it's not starting from a platform of let's see how aspirational we can get. It's like, let's get the negative out of this and just get to at least the first step. Right.
I mean, I think that one of the things that you see in the film is that there was this feeling coming out of the period of slavery that, for African Americans, there was a real feeling that, okay, if we just get an education, if we just get that thing that's been denied us,
right.
If we learn to read and write, if we can get that, then everything's going to be okay,
right.
and we will progress. Of course, that didn't happen, and so that's part of our history.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, is because you've got this legacy of Booker T. Washington versus the legacy of Charles Hamilton Houston. It's like, if you just kind of hear the names, you think of kind of great people, but one of them may have not been so great in comparison, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that has startled a bunch of people, so far in seeing the film, is that Booker T. Washington, is not a hero in this film. I'm not going to say he's a villain, but he's definitely not a hero. And I mean, I think that the way we color Booker T is that, because he was preaching this kind of industrial education, as someone says, this almost neo-slavery, it appealed to white folks in the South, and it appealed to the industrialists in the North. This was okay. We can do this if we're going to just educate black people for service. This is a way that we can see to go forward, and this is a vision for the country that we can all see. With white people still on the top, and black people, they're not enslaved anymore.
Harmlessly,
right,
harmlessly
right,
around.
right. But they're around, and
Yeah.
they're servicing us, and they're forming this service class. And Booker T. Washington's idea was someday this will end. And someday it will end, but we're not ready for this to end now.
Well, it happened in Martin Luther King's time, that last year of his life, even when he was speaking out against the Vietnam War, and a lot of people in the Black Congress and everyone, they didn't want him speaking on those issues because they're like, we're meant to be fighting this civil rights issue at home. You're going to get us kind of confused.
Right.
You're going to get these issues confused for us. Like, so sometimes people just want that next step, that good is enough, like, let's get that to the good enough kind of stage first.
Right. I actually did a lot of work in Zimbabwe when it was just gaining its independence, and very well-meaning people said, black people just aren't ready. Let's just give them, a little bit, and they're not ready to take over the country. And that's kind of always, how people look at real progress and real change.
We're protecting.
Yeah, right. We can't have real radical change. Let's just have it in gradual steps.
How many places did you travel to get this film done?
We probably traveled to 5 or 6, but we had a bunch of black colleges shooting for us.
All right, cool.
So we had, probably 10, 12 different colleges who shot for us and would send us footage, and we would critique the footage, say, no, I think you need to put the camera on a tripod,
Yep.
take the lens cap off,
Yep.
stuff like that, and they got better and better. And in the last section of the film, where it's today, and you kind of really see a lot of marching bands and a lot of different colleges, people, opening day of a lot of different colleges, and then graduations at a lot of different colleges. A lot of that stuff we got actually from the colleges themselves.
Yeah. Another point to me that just signified how relevant this is that like at Southern, when they're talking about disrupting the football games in order to get attention, it's still something that is done. Whether Colin Kaepernick being the prime example of it. It's like when he took a knee. Now every time the national anthem plays, everyone looks around to see if someone's going to do something a bit different.
Right.
So it still seems that in order to reach the popular culture, you have to go to where the popular culture is watching.
Right.
How do you do that with your films?
Well, I think there's a real idea now that you have to disrupt. If you're just on the sidelines protesting and people can go by and ignore you, then they will, and that you have to disrupt. I think hopefully what my films do. I do a lot of historical films, obviously, and what we're always looking for is how that ties into today. We're not trying to make films that exist in this historical bubble, where it's like, oh, wasn't that really interesting what happened back then? But we're trying to make films that then, you think about and the relevance to today. I think that, one of the great things that happens in the film, and somebody pointed it out to me last night, and I was so glad they got it, is we talk about the beginning of the sit-in movements in the 60s. And then when we talk about today, one of the women who's in college today is very involved in Black Lives Matter, and she talks about how movements are launched, are easily launched on black college campuses. Yeah. And so we try to bring it around to today, and hopefully, it gets pushed forward. It's not about the past.
Yeah, and if we look at the nominations this morning from the Oscars, you see films like 13th and I Am Not Your Negro, yes, both nominated in the documentary category. Oh, like 3 out of the 5 supporting actresses in that category, right, black women. It's certainly not last year's Oscars. It certainly seems like there's, at least in the pop culture world, some progress and some overdue progress.
Yeah, we'll see. No, it's great. It's great this year. I was woken up by a ping this morning that said, 4 of the 5 nominations are for black directors. And then that's just amazing. But somebody asked me a little while ago, in some interview, they were like, was this a golden age for black documentaries? And I'm like, you can say this is a golden year, but I'm not sure what makes a golden age. 1 year does not make an age. We'll see what happens next year. If you count this year and last year, no, it's not a golden age.
Right. Maybe they also have to render themselves unnecessary, right? So
yeah.
Filmmakers.
Hopefully.
Yeah. All right. Well, pleasure speaking with you, Stanley.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Cheers.
Yep.